Hi, I'm Serena Halstead.
I'm Spencer Ziegler.
Hi, and I'm Mellisa Smith, and welcome to Data Lid Podcast and to our latest series on feedback. As we mentioned in the last episode, the first part of this series will focus on the what, the why, the who, and the how of feedback. And then in the second part, we are hoping to have some special guests, so that'll be really interesting. So the last time when we met and we looked at the what of feedback, in case you might have forgotten, we have defined feedback as any action or information provided by an agent. And you also got to experience Serena and I as listeners receiving feedback from Spencer's on our haiku. I think Spencer didn't want to say, but I think I might have done a better job than Serena, but we'll let that kind of go.
Okay, yeah, we're going to let that one pass.
We're avoiding the labeling on the self, okay?
Yes.
He didn't say that with his words, but I kind of felt that from him with his feedback. So today we want to look at why, in this episode, why give feedback, right? So we looked at the what and we want to look at why. So Spencer and Serena, when you guys were in the classroom, what kind of feedback did you give and why did you give it?
Okay, so I think at one point we mentioned something about, sometimes when we give grades, we assume, well, grades is a part of the feedback. But in terms of giving feedback at the elementary level, for me, I would give both oral feedback and written feedback. And it also depended for me on the age group that I was teaching. For example, if it was like third grade, I find myself giving more oral feedback than written feedback because at that point, some of the students can read. And so whatever I write in their book, like a comment in their book, I know they could read it. But then there were some students who I know, still struggling readers. So what I write, they wouldn't make sense of it. I remember some students like, Miss, what do you mean? And so by this point in time, I would just call them to my decks and show them where they went wrong. So definitely depending on the grade that I was teaching, fifth grade, most of my students in fifth grade, they were readers. So I could write something in their book. Now, there are times when the feedback was going to be so extensive that instead of me writing a comment in their book, I would put in their book, please see me. And I would stress to my students, whenever you see please see me, you need to come to my table, because sometimes that please see me means like a complete reteach at my table.
Right.
But like I said, it all depends on the age, and I had to think about, can the student read? And if they can't, most of it was oral feedback.
Spencer?
Yeah, so it's interesting because you were primarily elementary school, and when I was in the classroom, I bounced between middle and high school. And so for me, likewise, I used I think a lot of it, I was relying on grades to communicate one part. And then I spent a lot of time giving that written feedback complementing the grades. And now, like what we talked about in the last episode, reading that, like, hey, if you pair the written feedback with the grade, they're probably not going to pay attention to the written feedback, just the grade. So now I think like, oh, I wish I knew that at the time just to delay. The other thing I think I did decent was just relying on peer feedback. And I think I had a sense of that when coming from a peer, and this is something that we're going to talk about in the next episode, it might be a little bit more readily accepted, but I didn't have the sense of just like the levels of that feedback or how to coach them to deliver it. So I wish that the research that we've done preparing for this, and hopefully y'all are getting out of this, I'd known when I was in the classroom, because I don't think I did as good of a job as I should have with that feedback.
Right. And for me in middle school, most of my feedback was around giving grades, and it was usually just written. There might be some oral, but a lot of it was just writing a grade in a book. And the reason I gave, because it was a requirement. As I started to sort of, in my own practice, sort of evaluate what can I do better to help kids, I did one time try to do like you did, put the grades and then put comments. Mm-hmm. And that, like you said, I recognize that didn't work, because then they only pay attention to the grade. Okay, this is what I got. And even though the comments was to help them improve, they couldn't care less. So it was just like, all right. And then I did try one time to do comments and no grades, and I thought we would have an uprising in the class. So, and I recognize now that you can't just spring that on kids, right? I kind of have to kind of create a culture. For me, sometimes I just felt as though my classroom was an experiment. I was just like, all right, you know what? I'm just going to put a whole lot of comments. And they were like, well, what's this? I was just like, this is your grades. Well, what do you want me to do with all of this? Use the grades to improve your work. And so, it was kind of like it just seemed like a culture shock. Like, what is this? Just tell me what I need and let's just move on from there kind of stuff. And so that I was like, do kids really want all of this feedback, or do they just want the grades? And then what's my role as a teacher to kind of foster what is the right culture for feedback? So I know we have a later episode where we'll talk about the culture, but again, it made me realize that, if you want to do or improve your feedback cycle, it can't just happen like sporadically. It has to be intentional, and you kind of have to like foster a culture for it. So when we talk about why feedback, so we all know that feedback is important, right? And so it's a part of the assessment process. I like to say that feedback is a part of the instructional process, but it's normally seen as part of the assessment process. And it has a significant effect on student learning. And as Hattie described in a lot of his work, it is the most powerful single moderator that enhances achievement. So when you look at Hattie's work, and he's done work in his research 2009, 2011, 2015, the effect size for feedback was always quite high, anything between 0.7 and 0.8 for those of you who like research and numbers. It's always one of those high indicators or strategies that you can use in your classroom. And yet, even though it's so high, I think we struggle with it as teachers to kind of see how can we implement it into our classrooms and make the most effective use of it. So they also said that feedback, when given effectively, can close the gap between current and desired learning. And I remember, Spencer, when you were talking about your work and the what, you kind of talked about those stages, right? What am I trying to learn? Am I there yet? And what can I do different? It's the feedback that closes that gap when students are asking that question to themselves. And so in researching for this, I came across the word cybernetics. Have you all ever heard of that?
Not till you brought it up. I thought it was a cool phrase.
Right.
I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, and so the study of feedback and the systems used for feedback is called cybernetics. I think of Cyborg and Terminator, but that's kind of where my brain went. But it says that our brain needs feedback to know how to act. And I just meditated on that for a while. Like, your brain needs feedback to know how to act. And I was like, okay, that sounds really interesting. And Tom Stafford, the gentleman that wrote that article, goes on to describe that how with feedback, or with a feedback loop, that how that enhances our ability to grasp and process and respond to information, which in turn allows us to follow the purpose. And I was just like, it sounds like, that's this sort of utopia kind of thing. But again, feedback is really key to that learning and teaching cycle, because again, it allows you to follow a purpose. And in our classrooms, what is our purpose? Right? Our purpose ends up being our learning targets. And it's just like, gosh, that makes so much sense. Right. So what are your thoughts on just that statement? Like, feedback helps you sort of grasp information, and in turn, it helps you follow your purpose.
So right before we started recording, Mellisa, you and I, we were talking about kind of like cell phones and how technology kind of what impact it might have on our kids. And I think that this is a reminder that if you look in other places of life where people are engaged, they're probably getting that kind of feedback, like on social media, that immediate likes and retweets. Now, that might not be going always to a positive purpose, but they're getting that. From video games, as an article I referenced a couple shows ago, you're getting that kind of immediate feedback there. So I think we can see in our world around us that, the brain does crave this. So we need to figure out how to use it effectively in schooling, and also to push them towards a positive purpose, mastering the standards, not just blind compliance or something.
Right.
And going back to Melissa's question there about that, the why of it. So when you think about the learner and what the learning target is, the feedback needs to be, so the learner has what they need to improve on, right? Or the learner has their specific goals that they want to meet. But then when you provide that feedback that you're providing, there has to be some similarity between what the learner is trying to achieve and what the intended target is. And if there is not that, that merging of the two, that similarity, you find that the teacher giving that feedback and then the learner wants to maybe do their own thing, it's going to be a clash. And the process of improvement, because feedback is to, foster improvement. So if both are not merging, that similarity is not going on there, then that feedback doesn't become effective.
You bring a good point, Serena, because I think also too, like I remember in class, right? So we're all talking about feedback helps to improve. But have you ever, as a teacher, had a student where it seemed as though they didn't want to improve? Like that wasn't, like you kind of still had to, that wasn't, no matter how much feedback you gave them or support you tried to give them, to me, the learner themselves want to have to improve for themselves. Like that has to be part of their goal. Like you have a target for them, but you also want them to, meet the goal, but they have of themselves have to want to meet that goal. To me, there's that little innate piece that's also part of it too.
If it's not their goal,
right.
If it's not their goal, because the game of education or some of these biases that we have built into it just kind of get in the way, then why would they care about feedback to meet someone else's goal?
Right. And so I think that's another consideration too, as we're talking about this, to kind of one of the considerations, the culture within it's done, making sure that, they say that when you're in teachers college, making sure that the students have a role in setting the standards or the learning targets. So they have a part in it. And again, it now makes sense why they need to kind of have a part in it, right? So that when you're giving feedback, it is of importance to them, right? Because we can all say, feedback is important so you can improve, but they have to see that importance as well, that they want to improve and meet the target. So if we know from all of the science, right, that feedback is effective, from our own classroom experience, we know the value of feedback to help students improve, then why do you all think if it's so powerful, why is it not capitalized more in our classrooms?
In terms of not being capitalized, sometimes we think that, as you mentioned before, that if the learner is not owning it, that's not a part of the learner's goal. So it's like you're pushing back against what the student doesn't want, right? So the student still have that ownership going on. So sometimes it's not capitalized because you think you're giving it and the students are not acting on it. So more or less, there's no value piece going on, right? I think it was Spencer, you mentioned like you give it, but like they're looking at, no, you, Mellisa, like, okay, so you give me this, what do you expect me to do with this, right? And some students are just wanting to be done. So no matter how much you are giving maybe good feedback, quality feedback, this was what they really wanted to accomplish and they think they have accomplished it. So then they're not valuing it. And because they're not changing or making any improvements to what you have given them, over time, maybe you, the teacher, start saying, you know what, it doesn't even make sense to write this in their book. It doesn't even make sense to tell them to improve this because they're not even valuing it. And then it's not capitalized because now that you're seeing that they're not applying it, then you kind of start backing up and not giving it to them.
Yeah. For me, I think a big part of it is time. So in preparing for this, read an article we'll drop in the show notes, Making Time for Feedback by Fry and Fisher. And there's a quote that really spoke to this. It says, unfortunately, most secondary teachers have far too many students to make it realistic to provide individual face-to-face feedback, so they rely on written feedback to do the heavy lifting. In an attempt to provide students with information about their performance regularly, they grade papers until the wee hours, writing carefully constructed comments in the margin. And it takes a lot of time. And that's where one of the things here is how to use that time as efficiently as possible. And that article, I think, is really helpful. There's another article we'll drop in the show notes from Cult of Pedagogy on flash feedback with the podcast there. And there's some strategies. And we're going to unpack some of the strategies in this series. So hopefully between those, we can make so it doesn't require quite as much time as perhaps it might have previously.
Yeah, I think both of you bring up a good thing in terms of, as from a teacher's perspective, the timing thing for sure. It was much easier to just put grades on the paper and give evaluative feedback than it is to give descriptive feedback. And then I knew sometimes, if I'm being honest with myself, in giving descriptive feedback, then I think of what Serena says in terms of the value. Are they going to value it? Am I using all of this time to give descriptive feedback? Are they going to value it? Without sometimes realizing I have to, again, create the culture in which it is valued, right? I just can't just spring this on them. I kind of have to set up the stage for all of this to be worthwhile so that the time that I put in is seen as valuable to them as well. So I know when we were preparing for this, one of the things we talked about, and like I said, we each come from a different background, with Serena being elementary, I'm middle, and Spencer, you're middle and high, that we talked about how feedback is valued differently as the learner progresses, right? So as I got older kids, when I interact with older kids, they don't seem to value descriptive feedback as much as, my interactions with younger kids. So what is your thoughts about, does it change? Does the value of feedback change as the learner progresses?
Yes, I would say it is seen differently or valued differently. And like I said, going back to that age group, depending on the age, let me give an example here. So do you guys remember getting those little stickers in your book, like great with an exclamation mark or a wow or a smiley face? So
Yeah, I got a lot of shruggy faces.
right. So,
Is that like the meh emoji?
Yeah,
yes. And let me tell you, as old as I am, I would, even in high school, I was looking forward to those little stickers in my book. But, it is valued. I would say it is valued differently. So at the lower grades, a student getting that little sticker, yes, that's all they wanted to see. Yes, I did a good job, right? And sometimes you get that up smiley face, you get that down face. And students will take that personal, especially in the lower grades, right? Now, as the learner gets older, and like I said, it goes back to what they're experiencing, that feedback can be welcomed or it can be a pushback where they're not valuing it. What they're experiencing at the moment too can also cause that pushback. And I can think about even my teenage years. You're more self-aware and you think your classmate is observing, and so at that point in time, that personal thing that is going on with you, but then here's the teacher giving feedback. It's as if you not even thinking of the feedback as being related to your work, but it's like what should I say, maybe that criticism of what you are personal.
And yeah, if it's on that self level.
Right. It's on that self level depending on what you're experiencing in your lifetime. And I can even say at even my age right now, I'm studying. And what the teacher say to me being in my studies at this point in time, it's no longer where I'm looking at myself. It's like I'm looking at what I should have known at this point in my lifetime. Are you really telling me that I don't know this at this point in my age? Right? So the feedback, depending on what you're experiencing and your age and all of that, the feedback can be valued differently.
Yeah. And I agree that it depends on how we condition kids over the years to think of feedback. Is it empowering or is it dehumanizing? When that paper is coming back to them, are they thinking like, this is going to give me the resources and ideas and steps that I need to get towards my goal? Or is it like triggering their amygdala and saying there's going to be a source of anxiety, so I need to kind of like shut down right now? I mean, that John Hattie quote, feedback is one of the most powerful influences on learning and achievement, but this impact can be either positive or negative. So yeah, and so it's up to us, and even it's up to all the teachers that taught the kids that you have before they stepped in your room. Because even then, like you were saying, Mellisa, that one example before, you can try something that's research-based, but if kids have years of conditioning that tell them that like, now this means something else, it's going to take some time to kind of recondition the kids. And their brains are malleable, so we can do it. But just remember that they're coming in our classroom with a lot of different experiences. And hopefully us in Wake County and anybody else that might be listening to this, we can change that culture of feedback so that when they are coming in 10th grade, it's all the more powerful for those 10 years previously that showed them just how powerful feedback can be. But it's up to us.
Yes.
And I think too, in both of your examples, I'm thinking of again what we discussed in the last one about the task and the process. Like those things are always true, but the self. I mean, even though as students progress, the self is always important. And again, as Serena was saying, depending on where you are in your learning and in your education, you're always tied to yourself. You're always thinking about yourself. And so as a teacher, it's important to kind of consider when you give feedback on task and process, how does that affect the feedback on self, right? Because it's really, I don't know if it's a mission to us to, even though whatever you provide, we forget the task and the process, and we begin to internalize it to self. So I think, as you said, it's that conditioning. How do we help students condition their brains to receive feedback in a way that is helpful to them? And so in the next episode, we'll be talking about the who of feedback. And I think it's really nice that after we talk about the what and the why, we talk about who are the players, right? This whole cycle and this whole feedback loop. The one thing that resonated with me with the article on cybernetics is that loop, the feedback loop, right? So there's a giver and a receiver, a teacher and a student, and there's a constant process going on in between. And so I'm excited to sort of dive into that in our next episode as we look at the players and the role that they play in giving effective feedback. And so please join us again for our next episode where we'll be looking at the who of feedback. And so for more on this topic and others, remember to go to www.wcpss.net/datalit. And you can send us questions there as well, because in our second half of this series, we want to dive into some of those questions about feedback. So that's it on this episode, and we look forward to seeing you guys on our next episode. Bye.
Bye.